It was supposed to be a routine stop. But what this rookie cop didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel held more power than anyone on his force. And what she was about to say would change his life forever. The morning sun spilled across the quiet streets of Brooksville, a town where not much ever happened. At least not visibly. Birds fluttered across telephone wires. Commuters moved in a sleepy rhythm, and Officer Daniel Reyes adjusted the mirror of his patrol cruiser for the third time. It was his first shift on his own. No partner, no trainer, just him, his badge, and a pair of trembling hands gripping the wheel. The police radio crackled softly, background noise for a mind racing faster than the speed limit signs he passed. Daniel's uniform was crisp, boots polished, but his thoughts were far from steady. He kept replaying his sergeant's final words in his head. Be alert, be respectful, but never soft. People can smell hesitation. But it wasn't hesitation that troubled Daniel. It was pressure. Pressure to be right. Pressure to not mess up. Pressure to prove that he belonged in that uniform. As the cruiser rolled through suburban sprawl, his eyes darted between cars, driveways, and intersections. A training from the academy echoed his mind. No infraction is too small. Law is law. That morning's briefing had been crystal clear. There were a string of recent burglaries, and the town was on edge. Every stop mattered. Every detail could be the difference between safety and chaos. 10 minutes into his patrol, a silver sedan caught his eye. It wasn't speeding. But as it turned left in an intersection, Daniel noticed a faint flicker of the left tail light. It blinked weakly, barely visible in daylight. To anyone else, it was a minor issue. To Daniel, it was an opportunity. He hesitated. Should he let it go? No. The academy drilled discipline into him. Details mattered. He tapped the lights. The red and blue glow reflected off the back of the silver car. The vehicle slowed, then pulled over gently to the side of the road. His heart pounded. The first solo stop of his career. He parked behind it, took a deep breath, and grabbed his notepad. As he approached, he reminded himself. Firm, professional, respectful. But the second he reached the driver's window, something shifted. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a calm, older woman in her 60s. Her posture was poised, her face serene, and her eyes deep, sharp, and knowing. She wore a dark navy blazer, her gray hair neatly tied back. She looked more like a professor or a diplomat than a typical driver. "Good morning, officer," she said, her tone pleasant but firm. Daniel cleared his throat. "Good morning, ma'am. The reason I stopped you is your left taillight. It's very dim, almost non-functional. Can I see your license and registration, please?" Without hesitation, she handed him both documents. There was no panic in her eyes, no argument, just a quiet confidence that unnerved him more than any shouting ever could. He stepped back and returned to his patrol car. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They were frozen. He looked down at the license. Margaret H. Taylor. The name seemed familiar. He typed it into the system for standard checks. But something in his gut turned. That name. He'd heard it before. Somewhere serious. He scrolled further down the data on his screen. Occupation. Superior Court Judge, County Division. His stomach dropped. He had just pulled over a judge. Not just any judge, Judge Taylor. The same Judge Taylor who presided over high-profile corruption cases. The same judge whose name was spoken with either fear or deep respect in the precinct. A name every officer knew, but few ever encountered off the bench. He looked up at the woman in the car. She sat patiently, eyes forward, hands resting on the wheel. No sign of annoyance. No hint of superiority. Just stillness. He panicked. Should he return and apologize? Should he cancel the citation? Should he say nothing? The voice of his sergeant returned. Everyone's equal in the eyes of the law. No special treatment. But this wasn't just anyone. And Daniel was still trying to figure out where law ended and politics began. He took another breath, then exited the car. As he walked back to the driver's side window, his mind raced through every possible scenario. He knew one wrong word could become tomorrow's headline. One wrong action could spark a complaint or worse, discredit him on his first day. But what happened next would leave him stunned. Daniel stood next to the driver's window, heart pounding beneath his vest. As much as he wanted to hide his nerves, he could feel his throat tighten, his voice thinner than before. The woman turned to him calmly, her expression unchanged since their first interaction. She hadn't flinched when he returned, hadn't looked away when he stared just a second too long. If anything, she looked expectant, like she already knew he'd come back with questions. I ran your information through the system," Daniel began, trying to keep his tone steady. "Everything checks out. I noticed your ID lists your occupation as a judge. Are you Judge Margaret Taylor?" She nodded once, not pridefully, but factually, like she was confirming the time of day. "Yes, I am." Daniel blinked. It felt strange hearing it directly from her lips, even though the screen in his cruiser already told him everything. It wasn't that she looked intimidating. If anything, her presence was peaceful, but knowing who she was made the moment heavier. He'd been taught that power came with presence, but hers was quiet, controlled. It made him more uneasy than if she had started yelling. "Ma'am, I didn't realize that you were at the time of the stop," he admitted. "That's good," she said. "You're not supposed to. If I needed to announce who I was to avoid a traffic stop, I'd be failing at my job." Her words landed sharply, but there was no venom in her tone. She was right. Equal under the law. No one above it. Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the flush rise in his face. He felt like a rookie all over again, and not just because he was one. There was something deeply disarming about how she didn't use her authority, like a weapon. In fact, she hadn't used it at all. She'd let him do his job, even when she could have easily leaned on who she was. "I, was considering writing a warning for the taillight," Daniel said. "It's not fully out, but it's definitely too dim to pass inspection. Usually I'd—" She raised a hand gently, not interrupt, but to bring his spiraling thoughts to a halt. "Officer Reyes," she said, reading his name off his badge with a slight glance. "Do what you were trained to do. If you think a warning is appropriate, issue one. If not, write the citation. Don't let who I am interfere with how you do your job." There was again that strange calm power. She wasn't testing him, yet it felt like she was, but not in a manipulative way. More like she was watching to see if he'd uphold the very principles she'd spent decades defending from a bench. Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. "I just want to be respectful, ma'am. I didn't mean—" "Respect isn't shown by backing down," she said, leaning slightly forward. "It's shown by standing up straight. Standing in your responsibility." That struck him harder than he expected. She could have made this stop difficult, could have used her title to lecture him. Instead, she was reinforcing the very thing he needed to hear. Permission to trust his training. He made a decision. "I'll issue a written warning," he said, pulling out his pad. "Not because of who you are, but because I would have done the same for anyone today." She offered a faint smile. "Good. That's how it should be." As he scribbled the details onto the notepad, his hands were steadier than before. He handed her the warning slip, explaining it quickly, though she clearly didn't need the explanation. When their eyes met again, he saw no superiority in hers, only an odd kind of mentorship, as if she was quietly evaluating his potential, not for the courtroom, but for the streets. "I appreciate your professionalism," she said, folding the slip and placing it neatly in her glove compartment. Most would have either frozen up or bent over backwards. "You did neither." He exhaled quietly. That felt like a compliment. A real one. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said reflexively. She raised an eyebrow, amused. "I'm not in court right now. Margaret is fine." He gave a small laugh. Too nervous to be natural, but too sincere to be awkward. Right. Of course. Margaret. Before stepping away, he paused. If I may ask, have you ever been pulled over before? She considered the question, then shook her head. Not in years. Maybe not since I was your age. That surprised him. So, this really was a random first. It was, she said, and I'm glad it happened. He didn't know how to respond to that. Why would someone with her level of influence be glad to get pulled over? As if reading his mind, she added, because most people in my position forget what it feels like to be on the receiving end of authority. And most officers forget how powerful their tone and choice can be, long before they ever touch their weapon. That sentence stayed with him as he watched her car pull away moments later. She hadn't challenged him. She hadn't humiliated him. She had simply made him see something different, how power, when carried with grace, could correct without crushing. Back in his cruiser, he sat in silence. The traffic stop had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an entire shift had passed. A strange mixture of relief and reflection settled over him. He didn't feel embarrassed. He didn't feel proud either. What he felt was something closer to aware. The streets around him were still quiet, but they no longer felt ordinary. Every vehicle, every driver, every conversation, potential turning points, just like this one. And for the first time since stepping into uniform, he wasn't afraid of the responsibility. He understood it. Daniel sat in his cruiser long after Judge Taylor's sedan disappeared down the street, the engine idling softly beneath him. The moment was over, technically, but it didn't feel over. Not in his chest, and certainly not in his mind. The silence inside the car was deafening, filled only with the low static hum of the police radio and the echo of his own thoughts. He glanced again at the notepad in the passenger seat, the warning slip written, handed out, and filed away. A small action, but one that now seemed to carry more weight than anything he'd done in uniform so far. He replayed every word she said, trying to find some hidden meaning behind her calmness. She hadn't smiled much, hadn't flattered or threatened, yet her presence lingered. Her words echoed with precision, as though they were carved from something firmer than law books or policy handbooks. Do what you would do for anyone else. It sounded simple. But Daniel had grown up seeing how authority sometimes changed the rules of the game. He'd witnessed people get away with things because of who they were. And now, sitting in this cruiser with her ID still fresh in his memory, he realized he'd been dangerously close to bending the rules himself. Out of fear, not favor. He remembered the weight of his training instructor's hand on his shoulder during academy graduation. There'll come a time, Reyes, when you'll either be the officer who stood firm or the officer who backed off. Choose now who you want to be, because when that moment comes, you won't have time to decide. Maybe this was that moment, and maybe he'd passed the test without even knowing it. He looked out the windshield, scanning the road. Nothing had changed around him. Cars passed by, trees rustled in the breeze. Someone walked the dog across the street, but something had changed inside him. The lines were clearer now, not between right and wrong, but between courage and compliance. And what unsettled him most was that she had never told him what to do, yet he still felt like he had followed her lead. That was power, the kind that didn't need sirens or volume, the kind that made people remember your words after you'd already left. He drove on. Half an hour later, parked near a local cafe to grab coffee, Daniel got a call from dispatch about a possible noise complaint in a nearby neighborhood. Routine, nothing major. As he sipped his drink and prepared to respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Officer McGill, one of the older patrolmen at the precinct. It was short and oddly timed. Heard you pulled over the Dragon Lady. Still breathing. Daniel frowned. Dragon Lady? He realized McGill was talking about Judge Taylor. Of course. Everyone in the department had their nicknames for public officials, especially the ones known for being sharp, strict, or untouchable. But something about the term made him uncomfortable now. It didn't fit. She hadn't been fire and fury. She'd been composed, deliberate, firm without ever being rude. He wanted to text back and correct McGill, but he stopped himself. No point. Let them believe whatever myths they wanted to. Daniel had seen the real version, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to share it with anyone. Later that evening, while finishing paperwork back at the station, his supervisor, Sergeant Cruz, called him into the office. Cruz was a hard man to read. Not harsh, just measured. The kind of guy who kept his emotions zipped up behind his collar. Daniel stood straight, expecting either a warning or a lecture about watching who you pull over. But Cruz simply gestured for him to sit. "I heard about the stop today," he said, folded his hands on the desk. "Judge Taylor." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Cruz looked at him for a long moment, not judging, assessing. "You treat her any different than you would have treated anyone else?" "No, sir. I gave her a written warning for the taillight. It wasn't fully broken, just dim. Same thing I'd do for anyone else." Cruz leaned back slightly. She called. Didn't file a complaint. Didn't ask for special treatment. Just said she appreciated how you handled the situation. Daniel blinked. She called. "Yep," Cruz said. Said you were firm, respectful, and didn't flinch when you saw her title. Said you showed restraint and discretion. Called you level-headed. That's a hell of a compliment coming from her. Daniel sat in stunned silence. Of all the outcomes he'd feared, a compliment from a sitting judge hadn't even entered his mind. Cruz continued. "Most rookies get scared when they pull over someone with influence. Either they overcompensate or they back off completely. You didn't do either. That means something. To her and to us." Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. A small part of him wanted to downplay it. But another part, the part that still remembered her gaze, understood the moment for what it was. "She said something to me, sir," Daniel finally said, "told me to do what I do for anyone else, that she wouldn't accept more or less." Cruz nodded thoughtfully. "That's Judge Taylor for you. Fair to a fault. That's what makes her dangerous to people who try to cheat the system, and valuable to those who still believe in it." Daniel left the office with a strange feeling. Not pride, not relief, something deeper. Like he'd touched a current running beneath the surface of everything. The law, authority, trust. And now that he'd felt it, he couldn't forget it. As he clocked out for the night, he realized something else too. The most powerful people he'd meet in uniform might not raise their voices, slam fists on tables, or issue threats. Some, like Judge Taylor, would simply look him in the eye and tell him to stand firm, and he'd feel it more than a shout. Silent power. The kind you carry without noise. The kind that, if you're not paying attention, will shape you before you realize it's even happening. And for Daniel, that kind of power had just begun to leave its mark. Daniel stood beside the driver's side window, not with a ticket in hand, but with a tight knot in his chest. The clipboard felt heavy. He looked at the older woman behind the wheel. Not just a driver now, but a figure with unexpected weight and presence. Judge Margaret H. Taylor sat silently, waiting, not with impatience or irritation, but with a poise that made him question everything about the moment. He took a breath. "Ma'am," he said, hesitating. "I'm new. This is my first solo week on patrol." Judge Taylor didn't respond with surprise. Instead, her eyes softened and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Everyone has a first week," she said calmly. Something in the way she said it gave Daniel permission to breathe again. "I'm trying not to mess up," he confessed, ashamed of how nervous he sounded. "You're not messing up," she replied gently. "You're learning." There was a silence that wasn't awkward. It was reflective. Daniel was unsure whether to thank her or apologize. So he just stood there, shifting his weight, the way rookies do when they don't know what comes next. I used to be a public defender, she continued, eyes looking at the steering wheel as if it were a window into the past. Fresh out of law school, nervous, eager, overprepared. One day, I argued the wrong precedent in court. Lost the case. My client ended up doing time. I didn't sleep for days. Daniel's eyes widened. What happened after that? I showed up the next day. And the day after that. And eventually I became better. Not perfect, but better. Her calm voice held the gravity of someone who had lived through more than she revealed. You know, she added, turning her gaze back to him. Confidence without humility leads to arrogance. But fear without discipline? That leads to failure. Daniel nodded, absorbing every word. It wasn't just advice. It was something deeper, the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from a lecture, but from pain, growth, and time. I never thought someone like you, someone at your level, would talk like that, Daniel said quietly. Judge Taylor raised an eyebrow. You mean someone who wears a black robe instead of uniform? He chuckled nervously. I guess. Well, she said, robes and badges don't make us more important. They just give us different responsibilities. Daniel glanced at the citation pad in his hand again. Should I give you the warning? Her eyes didn't blink. You tell me, officer, what would you do if I weren't a judge? The question was clear. She was giving him space, not letting him off the hook, not using her position, but reminding him who had the authority in this moment, and challenging him to use it wisely. I'd let you off with a verbal warning, he said, finally steadying his voice. The light's dim, but not completely out. Just needs attention. She nodded. Then you should do exactly that. Daniel felt the weight lift, not because he had avoided a mistake, but because he had walked through uncertainty with integrity and had been guided, not judged. As he stepped back in the car, she rolled the window up halfway, then paused. One more thing, she said. He leaned in. Power isn't the badge or the robe. It's in how you use it. With that, she nodded once and slowly pulled away from the curb. Daniel stood in the fading sunlight, the breeze brushing across his uniform, as her words echoed in his mind. They didn't feel like a casual remark. They felt like a seed planted deep. Back in his patrol car, Daniel didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring at the road ahead, knowing it had changed, not because of flashing lights or sirens, but because someone had taken the time to see him, not just as a rookie cop, but as a man in formation. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the precinct as Daniel walked in, coffee in hand and nerves still slightly buzzing from the day before. He tried to act normal, nodding at officers, checking the patrol schedule, but there was a shift in the air, something subtle, something he couldn't quite name. He didn't have to wait long to find out. By mid-morning, whispers began trailing him. Two veteran officers near the coffee machine stopped their conversation when he walked past, only to resume in low murmurs behind his back. At first, Daniel thought he was being paranoid. But then Officer Riley, a long-timer with 20 years on the force and a reputation for being gruff, gave him a rare nod and said, Heard you met royalty on your route yesterday. Daniel blinked. Excuse me? The silver Lexus. Judge Taylor. Word gets around fast. Rookie. Before Daniel could respond, a younger officer nearby chuckled and added, Man, you've got guts or no idea who she was. Daniel forced a smile, but his stomach tightened. Was this good or bad? Was he in trouble, or just the subject of station gossip? He didn't have long to stew in it. Within minutes, he was summoned to the supervisor's office. Sergeant Lewis was an imposing man with sharp eyes and a clean desk. When Daniel entered, Lewis didn't look up right away. Instead, he motioned for him to sit, flipping through a printed report. The silence was thick, like the calm before a storm. Finally, he spoke. So, you pulled over Judge Margaret Taylor. Daniel sat straighter. Yes, sir. You know who she is? I do now, sir. I didn't at first. Lewis looked up, his expression unreadable. And you let her go with a verbal warning? Yes, sir. Why? Daniel didn't flinch. Her tail light was dim, not out. It met the standard for a warning. She didn't argue. She listened. She was respectful. I treated her as I would anyone else. There was a pause. Daniel braced for judgment. But then Lewis leaned back, a faint smile creeping across his usually stern face. Good answer. Daniel blinked. Most rookies would have panicked, overreacted, or second-guessed themselves into a mess. Lewis said, tapping the paper. You didn't. You explained your decision, stuck to it, and acted professionally. That's rare. Relief washed over Daniel. But Lewis wasn't done. She called this morning, he said, raising an eyebrow. Judge Taylor spoke directly with the captain, said, and I quote, "Your department is producing officers who understand the weight of authority, not just how to wear it." Daniel felt his throat tighten. She didn't need to make that call, Lewis added. People like her don't waste time unless they mean it. You made an impression. Daniel didn't know what to say. Thank you, sir. Keep your head down, Lewis said, but his tone was lighter now. And keep doing the job the right way. Word continued to spread. That afternoon, while dropping off paperwork at municipal court, Daniel noticed two court clerks whispering when he passed. One of the bailiffs, an older man with sharp eyes, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Later, another judge who happened to be in the hallway offered a cryptic smile and said, "You handled yourself well, Officer Daniels." By evening, Daniel's name had traveled further than any siren ever could. He wasn't famous. Not really. But he had become something more valuable. Quietly respected. And that respect came not from bravado, not from busting down doors or making flashy arrests, but from one simple, principled encounter. A stop that became a story. A moment that rippled far beyond its few minutes on the street. Back in the precinct's locker room, Daniel found a small note taped to the inside of his locker. No name, just a few words written in careful script. Backbone doesn't make you loud. It makes you steady. Stay steady. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet. He had a feeling he'd be carrying that piece of paper for years. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Daniel replayed the encounter again and again, not for validation, but for understanding. The respect he'd received, the praise, the nods, all of it was secondary. What mattered most was that he hadn't compromised. He had treated someone powerful with the same fairness he would offer anyone, and in doing so, he had discovered that integrity didn't demand an audience. It only demanded consistency. It had been a quiet week since the now legendary traffic stop. The station had moved on to new gossip, new cases, new emergencies, but for Daniel Reyes, the experience still lingered in the back of his mind like a bookmark on a life lesson. He'd kept his head down, done his rounds, responded to calls, and taken comfort in the steady rhythm of the job. But nothing had quite matched the intensity or the dignity of that short encounter with Judge Taylor. On Monday morning, his assignment sheet brought something different. Courtroom Security, Department for Civil Case 10893. Nothing unusual. Officers rotated through courthouse duty all the time. Still, when he arrived at the building, dressed in his formal blues and signed in at the security desk, he felt a subtle tension creeping into his chest. Department 4. That sounded familiar. As he made his way down the hall, his boots clicking softly on the polished floor, he passed clusters of attorneys, paralegals, and clerks discussing motions and filings. He paused outside the door to Department 4, adjusted his posture, and stepped inside. The courtroom was already half full. Lawyers were arranging binders on desks. Clerks were shuffling papers, and spectators were finding their seats. Daniel scanned the room quickly, taking in exits, layout, and potential blind spots, instincts drilled into him from training. Then the door behind the bench opened, and Judge Margaret Taylor entered. He froze, Not dramatically, but enough for his breath to pause and his thoughts to catch. There she was, robed in black, posture straight, expression composed. The same woman he'd stopped by the roadside just a week ago. The same woman who had spoken to him not as a threat, not as a superior, but as a teacher. Her eyes scanned the room as she approached the bench, assessing everything with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Then, for the briefest moment, her gaze landed on him. No words, no nod, just a flicker of a smile, small, restrained, but real. Daniel nodded subtly, returning to his neutral stance. He reminded himself, "You're here to do your job." Still, it was impossible not to watch her. Not out of curiosity, but out of growing admiration. Judge Taylor ran her courtroom like a captain steering through stormy waters, with confidence, clarity, and calm. Even his opening statements began in what was clearly a complicated civil case involving multiple parties and high financial stakes. She never lost her focus. Attorneys, some easily twice her age, addressed her with a tone Daniel hadn't noticed before. Not fear, not flattery, but deference earned. She asked questions no one anticipated, cut through rambling arguments, paused the proceedings twice to clarify the record for accuracy. And when one lawyer began posturing too aggressively, she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Counselor, do you believe grandstanding served your client better than clarity?" The attorney backed down immediately. Daniel, stationed near the side of the room, observed it all with quiet awe. This wasn't about robes or gavels. This was about presence. During the mid-morning recess, the courtroom emptied for 15 minutes. Lawyers hurried out to regroup. The clerk began preparing documents for the next witness. Daniel remained at his post, hands loosely behind his back. Then, from behind the bench, Judge Taylor stepped down. She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she walked with purpose toward the side door where her chambers waited. As she passed him, she slowed only slightly, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "You're doing fine, Officer Reyes." Then she kept walking. That was it. Just 7 words, spoken with calm certainty. Daniel didn't move for a second. Then, instinctively, he took in a slow breath, one that seemed to settle deeper than before. He hadn't even realized how tense he'd been. But her words landed exactly where they were needed. Not like a shout, not like an order, but like a quiet torch passed from one pair of hands to another. He'd heard plenty of feedback during training. Praise from instructors, critiques from his field officer, encouragement from his mother. But this was different. This was recognition from someone who didn't have to say anything. Someone whose job required restraint. Someone who had no reason to speak at all unless she meant it. The trial resumed shortly after. Witnesses were called, documents introduced, objections raised and overruled. But Daniel wasn't just watching anymore. He was learning. Every time Judge Taylor asked a question, every time she enforced a quorum or clarified the law, he could feel the layers behind her authority. She wasn't just a judge. She was a compass. By the end of the day, the case was far from over. The court adjourned with instructions for both parties to return with additional documentation. The lawyers packed up. The clerks began collecting exhibits. Slowly, the room emptied again. Daniel stood near the doors as people filtered out. As Judge Taylor exited the bench this time, she didn't speak. She gave a small nod in his direction, so slight that no one else would have noticed. But Daniel caught it, just as he had the first time. Later that evening, as he walked his car beneath the fading courthouse lights, Daniel thought about all the things that uniform represented. Order, safety, presence. But now, something more: judgment. Not in the punitive sense, but in the measured one. And he realized something else. That brief roadside stop had introduced him to the weight of decision-making. But this courtroom, this quiet, commanding space, had shown him what true leadership looked like when lived out every day. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't demand respect. It earned it. And as he sat in his car, still in uniform, badge glinting faintly under the streetlight, Daniel felt a shift. Not a dramatic one, but meaningful. Like a page turning in his own story. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was learning what it meant to carry the badge with backbone and grace. Just like she carried the robe. And somehow, in a place of order and rules and unspoken codes, that meant everything. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel Reyes became a regular fixture in the courthouse halls. His assignments rotated, but more often than not, his name appeared next to courtroom duty. Whether it was intentional or coincidental, he didn't know, and didn't question it. Every opportunity to be stationed near Department 4, he welcomed without hesitation. Judge Taylor's courtroom became a quiet classroom. He'd watch her navigate all manner of cases, each day a different window into the human condition. One morning, it was a bitter custody dispute, where she gently guided two parents toward mediation instead of mudslinging. That afternoon, it was a petty theft trial involving a teenager who had stolen a pair of sneakers. The prosecutor argued for jail time, but Judge Taylor asked the boy a simple question. Do you want to keep being the person who steals, or do you want to remember this as the worst decision of your life? The courtroom held its breath. The boy mumbled something about his little brother needing shoes and how he didn't want to be like his dad. Judge Taylor listened, not just with her ears, but with presence. Then she handed down community service, mandatory counseling, and weekly school attendance checks instead of jail time. She made the boy promise, under oath, to show up in court again in 6 months. Not for punishment, but to share how he'd changed. To Daniel, it wasn't softness. It was strategy. He began to see the pattern, not in the rulings themselves, but in how she arrived at them. Judge Taylor knew the law code, but she wielded it like a scalpel, not a hammer. She didn't excuse wrong behavior, but she understood the reasons behind it. She looked at the person behind the file, and slowly, Daniel began to carry that insight with him outside the courthouse walls. Back on patrol, his instincts began to shift. He still enforced the law. He didn't let anyone off the hook, but he started asking questions before issuing orders. When he pulled over a young man for running a red light, instead of immediately reaching for the ticket pad, he asked, "You in a rush? You look like something's going on." The driver explained he was trying to make it to the hospital where his sister was giving birth. Daniel verified it, then escorted him the rest of the way. Another time, he responded to a call about a shoplifter at a corner store. It turned out to be a girl no older than 14, stuffing canned goods into her backpack. Her eyes welled up when he approached. "My mom lost her job," she whispered. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." Instead of cuffing her, Daniel called for a community outreach officer and stayed with the girl until someone from social services arrived. He also slipped a few bills to the cashier to cover food, not in uniform, not for recognition, just as a man who understood that sometimes rules weren't the first answer. He thought back to the way Judge Taylor handled the teenager with the sneakers. He had understood it then, not fully, but now, out in the streets, it began to make sense. Her compassion wasn't weakness. It was rooted in a truth he was just beginning to grasp. Justice, at its best, listens first. There were still tough days. Still arrests that had to be made. Still situations that required force, urgency, split-second judgment. But even then, Daniel found that pausing, if only for a breath, made all the difference. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was responding. One afternoon, while escorting a handcuffed man into the station, the man turned and muttered, "You're different from the others. You're not trying to humiliate me." Daniel didn't reply, but those words echoed. Different. It was never about being soft. It was about being human. And that humanity was something he traced back to that day on the roadside, when Judge Taylor had looked at him not as a badge, not as a mistake, but as a young man learning his place in a complex world. They didn't speak much, not beyond brief nods or the occasional, "Good afternoon, Officer Reyes." But Daniel didn't need conversation. He was learning from observation. Every courtroom session was a silent mentorship. One rainy Thursday, after court had adjourned for the day, Daniel lingered a bit longer, helping a clerk organize documents left behind. As the room emptied, Judge Taylor stepped out of her chambers, briefcase in hand. She paused at the doorway, looked at him, and this time she did speak. "You've changed," she said. "I see it." Daniel straightened, a little surprised. "Change how, Your Honor?" She offered a thoughtful smile. "You're seeing the job through a different lens now. Less about control, more about understanding." Daniel considered her words for a moment. "I didn't realize how much that mattered until I saw how you handle things. It's different from what we're trained to expect." Judge Taylor nodded. "Training teaches tools. Experience teaches judgment. But heart, that's what decides how you use both." Then she gave him a nod that was less formal and more personal, almost proud, and walked away. That evening, Daniel sat in his apartment, flipping through the pages of his old academy notebook. At the top of one page, he had once scribbled in bold letters, "Enforce the law. Protect the people." Tonight, he wrote beneath it, "Understand them first." And with that, he closed the notebook, knowing that his badge didn't just represent authority anymore. It represented purpose. A purpose shaped by the courtroom he now considered his quiet second academy, and by a judge who had changed his view of justice without ever giving him a lecture.